So if you haven't heard, we're getting a new core set in Hearthstone, and it's been promised that some wild format cards will be returning to standard in this core set. So I asked all of you in a survey which cards you'd hate to see come back and which ones you'd love to see return to standard. And I'm going to share those results in this video. Starting off with these cards behind me here. This is the cards you'd hate to see back in the core set, starting off with number 10 through 6. Then we're going to talk about the next 5 in a little more detail and share some of your takes on those. But clearly some Priest hate here in this set. Raza, Psychic Scream, Priest cards that are probably a bane to wild players, I'm sure. Little surprised Shadow Reaper Anduin didn't take the spot over Raza. I don't think Raza himself is particularly problematic. It's that Anduin that makes him feel really scary and wild, but maybe you guys just spelled Shadow Reaper Anduin wrong, so it didn't show up in the data quite as cleanly as Raza. You also got Barnes there, enabling some big Priest in the past. People hate Barnes, of course. Ice Block, very frustrating card to play against. Feels like it denies any opportunity to win the game. And Reno, I'm sure some aggro players were voicing their dissatisfaction with the opponent gaining health. They're supposed to go to 0. And yeah, Reno here is apparently a most hated card. So those aside, let's head here into the actual top 5 for the most hated cards that could return, starting with Patches, the Pirate. I'm in charge now, indeed. We don't ever need to hear that voice line again. And we even got some prequel memes here in the comments. I don't like Patches. He's all slimy and rough and irritating, and he charges everywhere. And I get it, right? Patches, if you were around in that era of Hearthstone, was incredibly frustrating because he was in every single deck, it seemed like. And he might just be a meager 1/1. There's still a lot of people who are confused why that's so powerful, but it's just a free bonus on board and often enough to turn the tide in those early shuffles where you're really trying to get some board advantage. So aggro decks would utilize this to just swarm really hard, get some extra chip damage, push, and ultimately win the game. And he was a great card in his era, remains playable to today, even though he doesn't have charge anymore. Certainly, since they've teased unnerfing some cards, God forbid Patches gets unnerfed and added back into standard, I think I would personally just not be able to handle that. So I agree with you guys on this one. I don't want to see Patches either. So next up at the number 4 spot is Jade Idol, and I'm so happy you guys picked this one. I've hated Jade Idol for forever. It is just such a frustrating card to deal with because it completely removes fatigue from the game, and I hate that. I like having fatigue as a win condition. Being able to outvalue and outcontrol decks is great, but when Jade Idol exists, you can't outvalue or outcontrol them because they just have these infinite dudes that get larger and larger, summon a larger man, etc. And indeed, we do not speak of Jade Druid around these parts. I think it's very, very frustrating for the game. I always thought it was a weirdly designed card just because of that limitation that it just denies fatigue forever. Minus very specific tech cards like Skulking Geist, but I don't want to see that back necessarily either. So I hope Jade Idol is tucked away forever. And it probably will be. You could make the argument that like, oh, they'd only bring back all of the Jade cards because they want to encourage that Jade archetype. I think technically Jade Idol could survive on its own, just as that fatigue preventer. It doesn't necessarily need all the other Jade cards to serve a purpose. It's certainly better in that world where they can all help you accelerate the size of your Jade Golems. But Jade Idol on its own is probably enough to exist independently. I just certainly hope it doesn't. So moving on to Baku, man, these really are just like some of the most hated cards ever. Yeah, I mean, Baku completely destroyed the meta along with Gen Greymane when he was there. Every deck was even and odd. They were just so oppressive, so dominant. In fact, they got rotated to the Hall of Fame early by a year. That's just how impactful and problematic these cards were in both the players' eyes and Blizzard's. So, no, of course I don't want to bring Baku back. Like, stay tucked away in wild format forever, Baku. I don't want to have to deal with you. I'm glad you're restricted to just wild. I'm sorry that people still have to deal with you to this day, but yeah, I can't handle more odd Hearthstone action, particularly with like Demon Hunter out there. Ugh, that sounds even worse. Thank God I've never really had to suffer that fate. Next up here is Ziliax, and this one surprised me. This is more of a responsible choice or like a nuanced choice, I guess, than some of the other ones. Like the last 3, I think were pretty obvious. Ziliax is a card a lot of people love, a lot of people don't really have particularly strong feelings for. It was very good. Obviously, it's one of the most consistent and reliable tools Hearthstone ever had. It got played in a ton of decks. Still the highest played rate I've ever seen for a card. Which, despite that, people didn't really seem to hate it. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, it's solid, it's good, it works. But nobody was like, oh, I hate Ziliax, he's ruining everything. And particularly if you brought him back into the core set now, Magnetic might be a little weird because it would be the only instance of the keyword. It's not an evergreen keyword like everything else here. So I don't expect to see Ziliax for that reason. But that said, for a core set to have one extra keyword or whatever, I don't think that'd be absurd for Blizzard to make that move. That said, I like some of the nuance in these comments. Like, there's plenty of design space for new cards to speed bump aggro. We don't need 12 more months of a neutral legendary in 65% of decks. I think that's exactly right. Like, there are other cards you can make that fill this role rather nicely, and that way we don't have to deal with this keyword issue, and we don't have to deal with a card we've already seen for forever. Ziliax, if that card could magnetize itself out of my life, that'd be great. And then finally, the number one option. This is a great choice, folks. I love you so much for picking Shutterwalk. Yes, we've all heard the voice line 87 billion times if you were there at the beginning of Witchwood. You've probably heard it like 40 billion times if you were there after the beginning of Witchwood. But Shutterwalk, obviously a card that really limits design space because it makes battle cries a really scary thing to design. Suddenly, your battle cries can be absurd if Shutterwalk is doubling them or tripling them or infinitely repeating them, as Shutterwalk is wont to do. So I can't believe this card really ever got printed in the first place. It sounds like even Hearthstone themselves had some debates about that, according to some comments Ben Brode made in that era, like, we can't print this. Maybe they shouldn't have. Like, it's a fun card in some ways, right, if you're the guy playing it, but if you're the one playing against it, particularly any infinite loops, Shutterwalk was incredibly frustrating to deal with. And in many ways, I think ruined the game for a lot of people. So I don't think that needs to come back. I don't think we need to restrict what battle cries can do. So Shutterwalk, another monster that needs to stay tucked away into Wild. So now let's talk about cards you'd love to see return to the core set. In Wild format, we had the most hated. Now we got the most loved. Here are 10 through 6. Yogg, Thaurissan, Trueheart, Dirty Rat, and Defile. And, guys, I think these are great choices. I'm a little surprised by Yogg-Saron just because of the chaos that ensues, but definitely a really fun card. Thaurissan's a little intimidating too because of the combo potential and disruption he can create with that. Like, he could really mess up a meta if he opens up some kind of broken combo, but it'd only be a year, so maybe Blizzard could control for that pretty accordingly. But these next three, Trueheart, Dirty Rat, and Defile, are all just really well designed cards. I love the idea of upgraded hero powers through Trueheart, not Baku, because it's slow, it's delayed, but it still allows you to do some pretty cool stuff like 4 armor for warriors, super fun to play with. Dirty Rat's a great tech card to deal with threats in your opponent's hand, pull out those minions or battle cries and ruin them. That's been an awesome tool. And Defile, I think, is just one of the most rewarding designs of a card ever, because figuring out that math, solving that perfect board state, and wiping your opponent's entire board for 2 mana can feel so darn special. I think a removal tool like that for Warlock that's so skill testing and rewarding would be fantastic to have. So that said, let's jump into the 5 here, top 5. Starting off with Loatheb. Perfect for the 5 spot here as a 5 mana 5/5. And speaking of cards like Dirty Rat, Loatheb's another great tech card tool. And I totally agree with what one person here said. Loatheb is the perfect counterplay card that rewards better players for knowing each matchup and when to play it. And I think that's true. It can be a great tool in aggro to stop your opponent from having that big board clear. It could be a great tool in a control deck to stop your opponent from pulling off a combo or whatever other thing it might be. Loatheb can be disruptive, and it's that perfect kind of mid-range card too, where it just feels like it's good to play. And even if you don't always notice or see the rewards or the result of Loatheb, it's probably making a pretty big impact and making your opponent's life a little harder, which can be pretty fun to see in Hearthstone. So as early as this card was in Hearthstone's lifespan, coming out in Naxxramas, the first new card set, I still think it holds up as one of the better, more relevant designs, and frankly, I'd love to have it back in Standard for at least a little while. So at the number 4 spot here is Tess Greymane, another great suggestion. Unlike Shutterwalk, which can feel so oppressive and frustrating to play against, Tess has a similar sort of effect, a big battle cry that's repeating things, but she doesn't feel as frustrating because it's usually random cards she's replaying, and often they can have downsides as well if you're not careful. And that really shows the two sides of this. Even though those cards are so darn close in what they do, Tess would be a welcome addition to me and many others, whereas Shutterwalk would be the most dreaded card in the entire set. And Tess just rewards that Burgle Rogue game plan, which is really fun because you go into every game not knowing what you're going to have or what you're going to see. You generate a bunch of cards from other classes, you develop yourself a game plan, and then Tess is sometimes a giant home run for that game plan, sometimes an unplayable whiff, and sometimes you don't remember what you've played and you just throw Tess out and see what happens. And I think that's great, and I'd love for Burgle Rogue to continue to get support in standard format. So Tess Greymane could definitely be a fitting centerpiece for that archetype. Next up, we got a repeat here with Reno Jackson. Some people would hate to see Reno. I'm assuming those are aggro players. And some people would love to see Reno. I'm assuming those are control players who want slow games and lots of health, which of course Reno provides, fully healing your hero. In fact, look right there. I hate aggro face brainless games. Well, that's all you need to know. Reno Jackson, make aggro decks cry bitter tears. Well, that's it. That said, I disagree with you guys. I don't mind the anti-aggro comments. I prefer control matchups as well. I play it all, but I like slower games. So I hear you there. The full heal is appealing to me, but I think we could go without Highlander support for at least a little while. We've had this Zephrys era for a long time now. Feels like Highlander's been a bit too important to Hearthstone as far as I'm concerned. I think we could use a year without Highlander. Maybe he comes back in the next year. We get some more Highlander stuff. But I want a little bit of a break from Reno-style decks. So personally, I hope we see Reno one day, but not quite yet. Next up is the Lich King. And as one person put it, they didn't get the quote exactly right, but they got the spirit of it. There always has to be a Lich King. It's close enough, and I totally agree with that sentiment, both the iconic phrase for World of Warcraft, but also the sentiment that this is such an important and noteworthy character in Warcraft lore, and frankly, a great representation of Hearthstone as well, because Knights of the Frozen Throne was such a popular and big expansion in the game that a lot of people remember fairly fondly. Lich King just represents so much. He's basically the go-to villain, the iconic villain of Warcraft in many people's eyes, and I think that's important to have around long term. I really wish he were a permanent feature in Hearthstone. We don't have permanent features in Hearthstone anymore without the classic and basic set, so the next best thing is putting him in the core set, and he could stay in there in a few years in a row. They don't have to rotate every card necessarily, so I think, of course, Lich King's great, and from a functionality standpoint and a Hearthstone mechanic, he's a great, just big late game threat that's like solid, playable, strong, but not like OP or meta warping or defining, which is a good thing for decks to have a big tool like that. And whether that's like the big decks we see in Hearthstone today or just the top end of a mid-range deck, Lich King would be a good fit, both mechanically and, of course, from a feel and flavor standpoint. And then finally, the number one card, this one really shocked me. Another repeat. It's Ziliax, because aggro can suck my nuts. I mean, what more do you need to say? I disagree. I don't actually think Ziliax, I don't think he belongs here. I don't think we need to see him in core set. We already talked about the magnetic keyword problem a little bit. Again, I don't think that's a restriction. Blizzard could work around that, of course. Just included, who cares? But more so, he was just everywhere for so long. I'm not ready to see him again. I want another tool to replace him that's similar. I'm definitely more in line with the people who would hate to see Ziliax than those that would love to see him. I mean, I liked the card at the time. I thought he was awesome. I love playing Ziliax, of course. Just he looks and feels awesome and rewarding to play. I love shutting down aggro too, but it's not time for Ziliax just yet. Let's give him a couple years of a break. Give him some time off. Then maybe when Ziliax isn't still so fresh on our minds, even though we've been without him for a little while, it's still just, it's been too recently. So give me a year or two, then I'm probably on board with this. But for now, I'm not quite ready for Ziliax just yet, although obviously you guys are. So that said, folks, that's it here. Those are the 10 cards you'd hate to see come back for the core set and the 10 wild cards you'd love to see come back for the core set, and we're going to do this again, but with classic and basic cards. You guys also voted on classic and basic cards you wanted to see, so stay tuned for a video in the next day or two covering that one. But until then, I want to hear your thoughts on these. Do you guys agree with the crowd here? Do you disagree? Was there a particular comment you take umbrage with? Well, share all those thoughts in your own comment down below. But until then, thanks much for watching. And until next time, game on.